Okay, and as I mentioned, today we'll just go through the requirements of Coursework 3. And the first thing useful to know is I updated the requirements in the module handbook maybe 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, or 3 weeks ago. And if you have the copy of the module handbook or the older copy or the older version, you might want to re-download the module handbook from the module page. And the part regarding to the coursework 3 individual work would have been updated. So it's under 7.4 coursework 3, and then individual work is 20%. And so the deadline is week 22. That means next week. So as usual, the deadline is Friday, 5 o'clock. And also, it's useful to mention, say, and this week we'll have one last lecture for this module. And next week is when the coursework will be due. And we will not have lectures. We will still have lab as normal, and the lab is only for you to ask questions about your coursework, but there will be no more lectures. And then after the deadline, so that's week 23 and 24, so that's 2 more weeks, and we don't have any lectures. We can finish everything, and the lab will be used for the demonstration of the last coursework. And if we can't fit everyone, and during the lab, I might, for example, using the lecture slots as extra demo time as well. I will see. But basically, and this week will be the last week we have the lecture, and then we finish in terms of the teaching new materials for this module. Okay, and back to the coursework itself. So essentially, and for this last coursework, and you need to update the front end of this app you have been building so far, this time, and using the native script view we covered, and also turns that into components. And so far you would have a version you mostly build in for coursework 1 using Vue and HTML, and then update maybe tiny bit in the second coursework, because second coursework is mostly about the backend. And then for the last coursework, because we're trying to build a native script, then you can't use HTML in the native app. For example, it does not have, say, paragraphs or div or h1. So you have used all these different tags from native apps that you can use. And also we change that into components, which I'll cover that more in that later. And then so first you have to use native script view. That's what we covered in the lecture. And you can either use the online editor. So we showed that in the lecture. So that's what it looks like. And you can also use and run the code locally using TNS preview. So you edit the code, say, in any code editor, for example, Visual Studio Code, and you run the command line and it will show on your form. And so both these are okay. The difference is this one, you edit your code online, and this one, you edit your code and on your computer. But you both need to show the app on your phone, which actually will be needed in the demonstration. Okay. Okay. Okay, and the submission will be slightly different and depends on how you run the code. Either it's online or it's locally. And either way, you still need to submit a zip file which contains all the code. And if you're doing this locally, for example, you run this by TNS preview. Actually, now you can just do NS preview, and for the latest version, you still need to submit all the code in a zip file, and again, excluding the node module folder. Otherwise, it will be way too big. You cannot submit. It will not allow you to submit. And in this case, you need to contain the URL to the GitHub repository with 10 commits. Okay, And so you probably need a new GitHub repository because the code is completely different. It's not you reuse any of the HTML code before. And so it's much better just to create a new one and with 10 commits. Okay, and if you use the online editor, which is the playground, you still submit a zip file. That's the same with all the code. And you can download the code from the playground like this. So if you go to playground and you click the download, which will give you a zip file. So that's quite easy. And because you're using the online editor, you will not have a GitHub repository, and it should have versions saved in the online editor anyway. But what you need to do, you need to submit the URL of your code in the online playground. Okay, and so the URL is just this one here. So when you save this URL changes and depends as you keep saving your code. And this will be the one you need to submit, and just a text file containing this URL. Okay, so that's the two ways to submit. So in both cases, you submit a zip file, which should contain all your code. And if you do this locally, you should make sure exclude the node module folders. And this is not included by default in the online zip file. And then if you locally, you need a URL to your GitHub repository. And if you do it online, and make sure you have a text file, including the URL to your online editor code, which is just this URL here.
So a question. So when we do when we run our code online, all we need to do is just downloading the file, yeah, after completing our code. Just just click on
Downloading the
downloads
file
and the
to,
zip file, extracted and submitted with along with the link.
yeah. And you just need to click this one, which give you a zip file. You don't even need to extract it. You can just
Okay.
add another text file and you zip them into another
Okay.
zip file. If you want to
And that's
extract this, it's also okay, but you
okay.
don't need to.
And that's all for the online editor, yeah?
That's right. That's all you need for the online part.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, can I see a show of hands? How many of you actually are using online editor? If you do, can you raise your hand? Ah, no one is using online editor. Okay. Okay. And then, yeah, so this is the same as before, and it has to be zip file, so it can't be, say, IAR or 7Z or something. And the maximum size is 10 megabytes, which should be plenty, so long as you make sure you don't including, say, the node module folder, which is very large. And also, you need to make sure your backend and the database are running, not just for demonstration, because I might need to check your code after the demonstration as well. And there are some marks which are related to the backend. For example, if you retrieve the lesson information and save the order into the database, you get some extra marks, or you get some marks in the marking scheme. So if you want those, you need to make sure your backend is running online, and otherwise I will not be able to check and you will not get marks for those. Okay, so these are some kind of hard requirements, which is similar as before. So you must only use native script view, which was what we've been covering so far. You can't use other libraries like Reactive Native or something. And then the front end must be created with the Vue single file component. So this is what we covered in the last several weeks. So it must be breaking to components and specifically using single file component. And finally, you must demonstrate the work just to make sure you understand the code. So, and you can reuse the code from my lecture slides or anywhere you find online. So long as you understand them, that's fine. That's why we need to have a demonstration to make sure you actually understand. Okay, and then we move on to the marking criteria. So the app should have at least 3 components. And the first one is a root component that we're including the other two components, which will be its child. So you always have this root instance or root component by default, so it's always there. And then in terms of the two child components, you should have a lesson list component, which shows the list of lessons. And that should be also where the user can add a lesson to your cart, to the cart. And you should have a checkout component where user can update and submit order. So update order means you can remove something from the order, and submit order, it just saved the order, and that's going to be saved to a backend database. Okay. And so the root component and has 8 marks. So it should have 2 tabs, one for the lesson list and the other for checkout. Okay, so the tabs is something you can easily use because it's a native app and it doesn't exist in HTML. It does not have element called tab, but that exists in native script. So you should have that one for the lesson component, the other one for the checkout component. Okay, and you need to register these 2 child components, import and register. Okay, and you need to respond to the add lesson event from the lesson list component. And so we'll come back to this a little bit later, but what this means is the lesson list should allow user to add lesson to the cart. The cart itself should be part of the parent component. And when the lesson list components needs to update the cart, it should not change the array directly, and it should emit an event, and you can call add lesson or something. And then the parent component should, once it's received this event, it should update the cart and add a lesson to the shopping cart. Okay, that's what this means. Okay, and the next one, the parent component should pass the shopping cart to checkout as a prop. And this is another thing, as we mentioned before, and the cart will be part of the parent component. But the checkout would need the cart because it needs to display the cart so the user can say submit or update. So the way for the parent component to pass the cart to the checkout is use the prop. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. We have examples in the lecture slides. And then last one, the parent component should respond to this remove lesson event. And then by removing the lesson from the cart. So what happened is the checkout component should allow user to remove items or lessons from the cart. And again, the checkout component should not modify the cart directly. Instead, it should emit an event. This time it has to be a different type of event compared to, say, add lesson. So the parent would know what to do, depends on the type of message event. Then the parent component should, once receive this event, it should update the cart and then remove the lesson. Okay, and so that's about the parent component. And any questions about this? Okay. Okay, and then so that's the second child component, which is the lesson list. And also again, exactly what you call the name, how you name the component is up to you. And I just use some name here so I can easily reference, so we know that's the component. So that's the first one. And it should be able to display lessons. And in terms of the lessons, it's the same as before. Actually, I only said 5 lessons here, and each lesson have 10 spaces. And the lessons should have these attributes, which you should already have now: subject, location, price, space, and image. Okay, and so this is a place where you need a backend. So the lesson information should be retrieved from MongoDB through Node.js on the API. Okay, and if you can do that, I think this is worth 1 mark. And so if you can't do it, that's not a big thing either. And you just lose 1 mark overall, that's all. Okay, and also the second thing that should be done in the lesson component is being add lesson to cart. So you should be able to add lessons to the cart, and this should only be possible if there's still space left. So if it's 0, you should disable that. And then every time when you add one lesson to the shopping cart, and then remaining space should be reduced by 1. Because that should be quite easy to understand. Okay, and so we mentioned this already, and the component itself, the lesson component itself, should not update the cart. Instead, it should emit an event and then trigger the function or code in the parent component to add lesson to the cart. So this is what we talked about earlier here. So respond to the add lesson event from the lesson list component. And again, so we have examples in the lecture of how to do this. And so you just have an event, and then the parent component respond to the event. Okay. And yeah, this is the same as before. It just say it's not allowed to change the shopping cart in the child component. In this case, is lesson component. You should send an event. You should send the event, and then the parent component will do the update. Okay, and then we have the second child component, which is a checkout. So it should show all the lessons in the shopping cart, and the lesson information must be passed to and using prop from the parent component. And then the user can remove lessons from the shopping cart. So in the shopping cart, the user should be able to either remove lesson or submit order. So in terms of remove lessons, again, you must emit an event and not update the cart in the component itself. So assume, for example, you can have a remove button and user can click that, which should emit an event. And then the parent component, in this case, will be the root component, then would have run some other functions to actually remove the lesson from the cart. And this is the same, just say you're not allowed to update the cart array directly in the checkout component. Okay, and the second thing that the checkout component do is to submit an order. So user needs to enter name and phone number before an order can be submitted. Again, it's a little bit more relaxed now, so long as user entered something for the name and phone number. So it's not required to say you have to check that's text in name and there's no only numbers in phone number or it's correct format. So if you already have done this, it should be there already. If you haven't done, just to make sure these are filled in, not empty. Okay, and finally, the order is saved and in the MongoDB and lesson space is updated accordingly. And so that means you need to, if the user clicks the submit order button, you need done the check and then you saved order into the database, which will be the same as before. And then the lesson space should be updated accordingly. So it should be reduced. It depends on how many space has been booked now. Then the remaining space or available space needs to be updated. Again, this is the same as before. So this is the only second place which still requires connection to the backend. So that was another mark. So even if you don't have backend, you should be able to still do everything else, and you only lose 2 marks, and which one here and one here. Okay. Yeah. And I think that's all. Okay. I have a question from Roddy Hat. Income says, do we need to include a link to MongoDB to check? No, there's no need. And all you need to do is just to make sure your online, how do I say? And the database is running, and that's all be fine. Okay. Okay, and is there any other question or? Okay.